Okay, so the topic of today's video is going to be cellular respiration, an overview of the process. Let's go ahead and get started. So when we look at cellular respiration, first of all, what is it? It's the process of our cells producing ATP energy. This molecule right here represents a drawing of ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Now, cellular respiration is what is known as an exothermic or an exergonic reaction because it releases energy in the form of ATP. Now, if we look at photosynthesis versus cellular respiration, for the chemical equations, photosynthesis, molecules of water and molecules of carbon dioxide and energy from the sun will produce a molecule of glucose and molecules of oxygen. So on the left of the arrow, you should know that these are the reactants of a chemical equation. And on the right of an arrow, these are the products of a chemical equation. Well, now let's look at cellular respiration. Let's look at the reactants first. A molecule of glucose and 6 molecules of oxygen will yield, let's look at the products, 6 molecules of water, 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, and energy. What I'm hoping you're noticing is that these chemical reactions are mirrors of one another. The reactants of one are the products of the other, and the products of one are the reactants of the other. And so after photosynthesis, glucose is created and it is used and broken down during cellular respiration to make ATP. Same with the oxygen. It's used in cellular respiration to break down the glucose and to make ATP. Now, if you look at the products of cellular respiration, the water and the carbon dioxide can be used during the process of photosynthesis. So these two reactions are very much complementary and in connection and in a cycle of nature with one another. Now, when we talk about the energy of photosynthesis, the energy is different. The energy of photosynthesis is sunlight, and in cellular respiration, the energy that is created are molecules of ATP. So the energies are different, but the other molecules are the same. Well, who performs cellular respiration? All eukaryotic organisms are able to perform cellular respiration. So that would be members of kingdom Protista, like this amoeba, members of kingdom fungi, like the mushrooms here, members of kingdom Plantae, like the trees, and members of kingdom Animaliae, like this frog here. Where does cellular respiration occur? Mostly within this organelle right here, the mitochondria. I say mostly because an early process happens in the cytoplasm. So what happens during cellular respiration? Well, you have to eat some food, and then the food molecules, such as glucose, are going to be used to create ATP. Let's zoom on into the bloodstream of this young lady. And there's a couple cells right there, and after a meal, you have a high concentration of glucose in the bloodstream. And so glucose will diffuse into the cells, and in the top cell, the glucose is going into the mitochondria, and the mitochondria is making and releasing a bunch of ATP. Now that happens in the bottom cell also. A glucose enters the mitochondria and a bunch of ATP are created. The ATP will allow these cells to do the work that they need to survive. And one molecule of glucose through the process of cellular respiration can actually yield about 36 molecules of ATP. When it comes to lipids and triglycerides, that number is even greater. One triglyceride can yield 146 ATPs. Well, let's actually get into the process now. Okay, when we move on to step 1 of cellular respiration, glycolysis, when you look at this picture right here, this is not an overview. This is the full process of glycolysis. It's incredibly complex. Follow the red square here. Glucose gets broken down and converted into this, which becomes this, which becomes this, which becomes this, which becomes this, and becomes this, and becomes this, and becomes this, and becomes this. And eventually you get 2 molecules of pyruvate. We're not going into this detail right now. We're going to start with glucose. We're going to break glucose down into molecules called pyruvate, and I'm going to highlight a couple things in between. That's the overview we're going to discuss. So let's look at an overview of glycolysis, the breakdown of glucose. So where does this take place? In the cytoplasm of a cell. So in my animation, here comes a G, and it's just diffused into the cytoplasm. Let's zoom on in a little bit, and there's the glucose molecule. Now, glucose is not just 6 carbons. I'm just using this picture right here to illustrate glucose. It also has 12 hydrogens and 6 oxygens. And so what happens during glycolysis? I like to use scissors to represent the actions of enzymes. There's a variety of enzymes that are going to break that glucose molecule down. And when they do, they break that molecule of glucose into 2 molecules labeled pyruvate, C3H4O3, and then 2 molecules of ATP. So that's an overview of glycolysis from beginning to end. Now, what happens next? Well, that's going to depend. If there's oxygen present, the pyruvates in my animation are going to go into the mitochondria. And that's where aerobic respiration is going to occur. With the help of oxygen, the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain will occur. Well, what if there's not oxygen present? If there's not oxygen present, the pyruvates stay in the cytoplasm and are further broken down during fermentation. Now, we are going to follow the aerobic pathway. This video is not going to discuss fermentation. We are going to discuss from glycolysis to the Krebs cycle to the electron transport chain. So let's move on next to the Krebs cycle. And when you look at this picture right here, the Krebs cycle is incredibly complex. This diagram here is the full Krebs cycle. We're not going into this detail. Notice what it starts with in the red box, a molecule of pyruvate, which becomes this, which becomes this, which becomes this, which becomes this, and then this, and then this, and then this, and then this, and this, and this, and this, and back to this. The Krebs cycle is incredibly complex. In our overview, we're going to talk about how pyruvate gets broken down and a few of these items are created. So in the Krebs cycle, which takes place in the liquidy interior, the mitochondrial matrix, it's known as. So what happens during the Krebs cycle? Well, let's focus on the pyruvate to the left. Those pyruvates are there because of glycolysis. And so let's focus on the pyruvate to the left. Through a very complex reaction, enzymes are going to break that pyruvate down. I'm going to highlight a few things that are created. 3 molecules of carbon dioxide per pyruvate. So 1, 2, 3 molecules of carbon dioxide. They diffuse into the bloodstream, the heart pumps them to our lungs, and we exhale it. I think it's interesting to know, where does our exhaled breath comes from? It comes from the Krebs cycle. Also, a single molecule of ATP is created, but more importantly, more important than ATP, more importantly, molecules called NADH and FADH2 are created. Now, the reason these molecules are so important is that these are hydrogen carriers. They're carrying hydrogen, and those hydrogens are going to be crucial in the third step coming up, which we'll talk about in a few moments. Well, let's repeat that process. There's another pyruvate on the right-hand side. In total, we get 2 ATPs because we have to add the pyruvate on the right-hand side. The Krebs cycle happens to this pyruvate as well. 3 molecules of carbon dioxide are created in the breakdown of that pyruvate. They're released as waste. Another molecule of ATP is created. That adds to the one from before to make 2 total. And more NADH and FADH2 are created. Well, let's go on to the third step next. So let's briefly look at the third step, the electron transport stage. When you see a picture like this, again, this is the full detail of the electron transport chain. It's a very complex chemical reaction. We're not going into this level of detail. We're going to highlight just a few events that happen in the electron transport chain. And it's still, even though this is an overview, it's still a tricky overview. So in the overview of electron transport, well, where does this occur? See the orange area labeled the inner membrane space. That's where the majority of this occurs, in the inner membrane space. And what's going to actually happen? NADH and FADH2, they're carrying the hydrogens, and those hydrogens have an electron. The electrons are pulled into the blackly drawn membrane that you see in the animation. Now, in that membrane, there are protein pumps. I didn't draw them, they're not pictured, but they're there. And those protein pumps are powered by those electrons. And so there are protein pumps that will pump the hydrogens from the matrix into the inner membrane space. That frees up the NAD and FAD. that frees up the NADs and FADs to return to the Krebs cycle to get more hydrogens. But let's focus on the hydrogens that are currently here. What happens now? We've created a concentration gradient. So there's a concentration gradient. There's a high concentration of gradient in that orange area there. I've just added what's called ATP synthase. ATP synthase is an enzyme that's really important. What it's going to do is it's going to bond ADP and a single P to make ATP. And so as hydrogen begins to diffuse from a high concentration to a low concentration, the energy from those hydrogens bonds ADP with P to make a whole bunch of ATP. This process happens repeatedly over and over and over, as long as there's a high concentration gradient. Now, that was a key, what I just said. As long as there's a high concentration gradient, this process will continue. But as more and more hydrogen diffuses into the matrix, we're eventually going to reach equilibrium. Equilibrium will basically shut this process down. So something has to come and remove those diffusing hydrogens. Along comes the air that we breathe. Water waste will be created. Here comes an O from the oxygen that we breathe. The oxygen that we breathe will bond with a couple hydrogens to make water waste. And by taking the water away, notice it maintains the high concentration gradient in the inner membrane space. So this process can continue. So that would be an overview of the electron transport stage. So here's a little review for you. And these questions right here, if you pause the video, if you have to go back in the video and find some of these answers, but I want you to find them on your own. I'm not going to display the answers. You got to put the work in. All right, so here's another little practice quiz for you. If you're in my class, write these answers on a separate sheet of paper. I'm happy to check your answers before class or after class one day. Thanks for watching.